Hello again. I welcome you back from your break. I hope you rested a bit. And I want to introduce our next speaker, Heleen Murre-van Berg. She's a PhD from Leiden, 1995, a professor of global Christianity and vice dean of the Faculty of Philosophy, Theology and Religious Studies. In addition, she directs the Institute of Eastern Christian Studies there. Earlier, she held the chair of Professor of World Christianity at Leiden University, where she also served as Vice Dean of the Faculty of Humanities. She published extensively on Christianity in the Middle East, especially on Syriac, Assyrian traditions, some publications, Arabic and its alternatives, religious minorities and their languages, and emerging nation states of the Middle East, 1920-1950. Also, Modernity, Minority, and the Public Sphere, Jews and Christians in the Middle East, 2016, and Scribes and Scriptures, the Church of the East in the Eastern Ottoman Provinces, 1500 to 1850. In March 2019, she won an advanced grant for research proposal, Rewriting Global Orthodoxy, Oriental Christians in Europe, 1970 to 2020 at ERC. So Heleen Murre-van Berg will speak about Middle Eastern European missionary-ecumenical relations in current research. Let's listen. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haigazian. It's really a great pleasure to be here today and to speak to you. And I will, in the meantime, try to share my screen and get the PowerPoint working. Yes. So it has been a great pleasure to be here, to be invited by Dr. Van Zane to join in this conference. As you may have understood from the brief introduction into some of the recent stuff I've been doing, is that whereas I did some work on the missions in the Middle East a long time ago, in the meantime, my research has moved a bit more first to the 20th century in the Middle East, and then the issue of Christians and nationalism, but then recently moved back to Europe. And I thought that might be a good place, in fact, to look back at what mission history and the history of Protestantism in the Middle East can mean also for the contemporary European situation. So this is not a fully fledged paper, but a few thoughts reflecting on what I heard in the yesterday and today, and thinking about what, on the one hand, what the importance is of mission history in these larger issues on thinking about religion, both in the Middle East and in Europe, the role of Protestantism in that, and the role of the Middle Eastern churches, and in that perspective. What has struck me also in the papers we heard today, especially Dr. Van Zane's paper, but also that of Dr. Joly, is the importance, is the fact that on the one hand we can see clear faces of missionary encounter, of partnership, that there is a sense that maybe we should be looking for something else, and that very much fits into things that we've been seeing when studying religion in Europe over the past, say, 10, 15 years. Just to recapitulate what we heard very clearly yesterday and today, is this sense of, on the one hand, we started with this encounter from European and American missionaries coming to the Middle East, Protestant missionaries who had this clear sense of what they wanted to bring. And of course, we also heard how what they wanted to bring, some things were received very easily and with gratitude and eagerness. Other things were not so easily incorporated. The modernization processes, the schools, the work for women and girls, the printing presses, the literature, all of that had a great resonance in the Middle East among those who became Protestants and among those who did not decide to convert to Protestantism. You see here the image of the American missionary graveyard near Urmia in Iran, And the interesting thing there is that you already see the beginning of the reverse and the partnership, in that in this graveyard you also find some of the early missionary, the converts to Protestantism from the Assyrians in the region. And as Dr. Haigazian already referred to yesterday, these activities of the missionaries also form the starting point of a change in Europe and in America to look at what is happening in the Middle East, to see Middle Eastern Christians and Muslims not merely as people who have to be converted to our perspective, but people that talk back and that have an opinion on how things should proceed. So slowly this moves into what Wilbert has explained so precisely, the partnership way of looking at how we do mission in the 19th century, in the late the 20th century, the early 21st century. And I think that is still a very important model that both from the perspective of scholarship but also of missionary practice will remain a basis for things to come. However, this model of partnership, I think in many respects, apart from the kind of institutional difficulties that were also referred to in the last paper, the issue of partnership also kind of assumes very clearly defined churches, clearly defined nations, clearly defined locations where people are, and then you bring them together from clearly defined perspectives. And I think what we are seeing now, if we look in Europe and we see what is happening there religiously, you see that these clear definitions, in fact, are disappearing. Of course, you still have the institutional churches, you still have institutional organizations, both within Christianity and in other religions. And the same very much is true in the Middle East, wherein the institutionalization of religion has a legal aspect that makes it very resistant to change. But at the same time, you do see that both in the Middle East and in Europe, the traditional boundaries are getting more fluid. And this is happening both in these countries as such, but it is also happening because you have all these migrations, especially from the Middle East to Europe, where in Europe, the whole perspective of what is happening with religion in Europe is gradually changing. So on the one hand, I share the thoughts of André Joly just now, that religion in Europe is in a completely different place than it was 30, 40 years ago. Secularization has made it very, has made especially Christianity less prominent, less strong, etc. But at the same time, if you look at what is happening in Europe, you see all these new types of religion, some of them Muslim, some of them other religions, but Christianity also being a large part of it. So Christianity in Europe is changing very rapidly. And I think the recent project I'm working on is about the Christians in the Middle Eastern Christians in Europe, but there's of course there's the groups, the African Christians, Christians from Eastern Asia. So really that has a big impact on what Christianity in Europe is. And I think it also has an impact on how we look and how we study religion in Europe and how we think about the future of Christianity, both in the Middle East and in Europe. One of the things that struck me, it was also mentioned in the paper on Iran, that there is all these new types of conversions, maybe from Islam, from people who have secularized over the past decades. So also in the Middle East, I think their religion is developing rather differently from what we may have expected a couple of years ago. So I think it is time to also consider how we now, what the role of Protestantism and the study of Protestantism can mean in this particular situation. And I just as a small kind of anecdote, when my very first visit to Syria in I think 1993, I was visiting a Syriac Orthodox community in Hasakeh. So I came there to see more of the Orthodox communities, But on the Sunday morning that we had been taken to Mass by a Syriac Orthodox friend who was also learning to be a priest. Then afterwards he said, there's another thing we have to do. And then he took us to Haseke, to the church of the Protestants that was just being inaugurated, had just been finished. So on this beautiful May morning, all of a sudden we were part of this celebration of the new church. And it struck me how then the Protestants were seen as completely integrated in the local community. And of course, I know for some of you that is nothing new, but for me as a young student, it was somewhat surprising coming from the study of the American missionaries in the 19th century. I had expected a lot more antagonism, but what I saw how the Protestants were kind of in the middle of things in Haseke. And so I think that still is part of how Protestants can see themselves and be both in the Middle East and in Europe, can be a bridge between various parts of religious communities, between the Orthodox and the Catholics, and also between Christians and others. In that respect, it has been mentioned a couple of times in the previous presentations, but it's very important to think about how Protestantism is linked to secularization and modernity. And there's a lot of literature on that, and that it's a very contentious relationship. So on the one hand, we can see how, in a sense, the secular modernity of Europe is something that is very much an outgrowth of Protestantism, but at the same time, Protestantism, of course, challenges some aspects of this secular modernity. If you now look at how, for example, in the Orthodox churches, people are thinking about when they move to the European context, how to deal with the secular modernity, they will again look at things that have been thought and written in Protestantism to motivate and to study it, to use in their churches. So that it's a very interesting going back and forth between various strands of Christianity, between various ways of looking at what modernity, what a contemporary form of Christianity could be. And then again, you see the back and forth also between what's happening in the Middle East and what is happening in Europe. So I more and more, for me, it's very difficult to untangle the different strands. So you see issues that are clearly coming, say, from a Protestant background, or from an Orthodox background, or from a Catholic background, but at the same time, there is all these interlinkages, all these connections between them. Of course, the charismatic movement is another such cross-cutting movement that influences all of these areas. I would say if then we look at what Protestantism is at the moment and where it might be heading, we see in a sense two different poles. And of course, if you have poles, you would like to look for what is in between them. But on the one hand, there is a real risk of kind of dissolving that the things that Protestantism, both in the modernity of Protestantism, but also in the issues of the way, the importance of text, the importance of thinking, the importance of faith as an individual conviction, are part of Christianity and of religion in a much wider sense, which can make Protestantism as a distinct group maybe even dissolve or disappear. And in some places of the world, that is a real danger if your goal is to keep Protestantism intact, of course. The other way is to reinvent Protestantism and kind of harness it against the threats of all these different ecumenical or secular movements. And I think perhaps as we are gathered here, we all would like to see something in between these two different extremes. And for me, it is important to think about this from the perspective of a term which already was mentioned also by the previous, by André Joly, I think, the fragility. And that is a way of, I think, on the one hand, accepting the minor role of an organization like ACO, of Protestantism vis-a-vis religions in general, but also Protestantism within Christianity as a fairly small actor that nevertheless can be very important as the salt, which is another very nice metaphor for this. And if you look at this, I was again struck by the fact that the action and support aspect of ACO that has been so prominent in the organization from the beginning is really something that still I think is very much can very much be a basis for further development. So the actual solidarity, the action, helping people in where they are, seeing people, focusing on particular groups that are maybe overlooked by others. You don't need to be a very big or important organization to do that. There was this beautiful story in the news last week about a journalist who had been traveling with refugees in, I think it was in Asia, and one of these refugees recognized her in New York and told her how important it was that she had done a documentary on their travels and on their hardships during this climb over the mountains. And she had never realized how much her documentary was important for the people that were traveling themselves, despite the fact that a lot of them did not make it, had to return, did not get visa or things like that. But the fact that there was this documentary was really very important for them. And so they reconnected in New York, and the story got out into the news. So I think this, even though these are not the world-changing events, they are still very important in building up community and bringing the mission forward. And I would like to end with a reference to the book by Arundhati Roy, who is from a Syrian family in India, and is a very important Indian writer. And she wrote The God of Small Things, and the title in itself I think is already telling, but the book itself really explains this further. But for her, it's very important to indeed go back to the small things in order to understand and to appreciate what the world could be and should be. So I really would like you to have a look at that book. And I thank you very much for having been here and been able to present some of my thoughts on ACO and Protestantism in both Europe and the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. van den Berg. Valuable discussion.